Good evening, everyone. My name is Michaela Moss, and I'm the Acting Executive Director for the Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument. Welcome to our 5th Tune In Tuesday educational event of the year, A History of the Friends. This is the last Tune In Tuesday before we celebrate our organization's 20th anniversary, which is happening this Sunday, April 18th. So the topic tonight is of special relevance and importance, so thank you for showing up this evening. For 20 years now, the Friends has been the leading voice in conservation for the monument, and we've been working diligently to protect and preserve the monument through education, stewardship, and advocacy. And no two people know this better than our guests tonight, Dave Mari and Dennis Tighe. Dave and Dennis were both longtime board members for the Friends and played integral roles, but very different roles in the monument's designation, the foundation of the Friends, and the monument's early management. So we're really lucky to have them both with us this evening. Thank you again for joining us, you guys. A little bit about tonight's format before we begin. I'll ask that everybody stays muted to cut back on background noise, but if you do have questions during the event, please feel free to type those into the chat box and we'll keep an eye on that and answer those as they come up. Otherwise, we will have time at the end of the event for questions. So if you want to save your questions until then, you can mute yourself, turn on the camera, and talk directly to Dennis and Dave there at the end. And with that, I will hand things over to Dave and Dennis to go ahead and introduce themselves a little bit more and jump into the presentation. Take it away.
Well, I'll start off, and the only thing I'm going to say, I was the manager of the Bureau of Land Management when the monument was being considered, and shortly after it was designated. I've been retired for 17 years, so that's all I'm going to say as far as background on me. I'll give you the inside scoop. By the way, if you see me looking down toward my lap, I have a cat that's trying to jump up on me, and I'm pushing it away. Michaela wanted us to talk about the history of the Friends, and what I'm going to talk about really is what was going on within BLM and the events leading up to the designation of the monument. I'll leave it to Dennis to talk about the history of the Friends, but I'm going to ask you to indulge me first, though, as I start off with a couple of references of historical recreation use. This has nothing to do with the topic. I just have a captive audience until you start all clicking on that leave the meeting button. Everybody knows, the Native Americans used the river for centuries. Lewis and Clark came up, the fur trappers, the steamboats, the woodhawks, the bullwhackers, the farmers, the ranchers. But as far as recreational use, the first one that I'm aware of, I'm going to hold up a book here, is Floating on the Missouri by James Willard Schultz. And I wanted to call your attention to it. Schultz came up on the steamer Benton in 1877. He got off the boat at Fort Benton at the age of 17, and he spent the rest of his life in that area. He lived among the Blackfoot and married a Blackfoot woman, and they named him Apicuni. And as an aside, he did some guiding for George Bird Grinnell, who was key in designation of the Glacier National Park. And Grinnell named a peak in the park after him. If you scour some of the maps of the park, you'll see Apicuni Peak. And the reason he floated the Missouri River with his wife, Sanito, I think they put in at Fort Benton and went down to the confluence of the Yellowstone. And I love the beginning of this book, and since I have a captive audience, I'm going to share a little bit of it. So impatient were we to be off that we had loaded up by the light of a lantern. But now the eastern sky was streaked with crimson, and it was quite light enough to see the channel. The swift current was gently tossing and swaying our craft as if to say, "Come, why tarry? Cast loose and I will bear you swiftly into the land of your dreams." Well then, the river should have its way. "Get aboard and take the stern seat," I said to Sanito, and as soon as she had done so, I pushed out into the stream. Splash! Sanito dropped a little beaded buckskin sack into the water. What it contained I know not, nor did I ask, but I heard her low prayer. Spirits of the water, people of the depths, accept my poor sacrifice. Pity us, I entreat you. Draw us not down to our death in your cold, dark realm. Cast us not upon the rock hidden by the foaming current. Pity, pity, accept my offering, I pray you, and harm us not. Whenever I canoe on the Missouri River, I take a little tea bag and I read this and I make my sacrifice to the river gods by emptying the contents of the tea bag. And I pray for a tailwind and the canoe doesn't dump. The second thing I'm going to mention just very briefly, like I said, it's totally off topic, was in the first Tuesday talk, Zane Fulbright, who's the monument manager, mentioned a gentleman by the name of Emil Don Tighe. And I think I see Karen's picture. I think he lived in Havre, and he took people on the river, I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Zane mentioned him. The family members have contacted Zane and would like to get some sort of memorial to Emil Don Tighe in the monument. Okay, so now I'm back on subject now. And I'm going to start talking about the process leading up to the monument. And if any of you are familiar, if you ever watch the Comedy Channel, there's a program called Drunk History, and slightly inebriated people give their spin on historical events. So I didn't bring any whiskey, but consider this an episode of Drunk History because, like I said, I've been retired for 17 years. I have no notes, so it's all memory. And I remember the events. I just don't necessarily have them in the accurate chronological order. So bear with me. The first thing I'll mention, in the 1970s, the Bureau of Reclamation wanted to put in a dam in what is now the Wild and Scenic River. And at that time, the livestock operators and private landowners and many others led the opposition to that. They have long memories. Some of their fourth and fifth generation ranchers, their ancestors had been, their land was condemned when Fort Peck was built, and they lost their land. And that led to the creation of the Wild and Scenic River in 1976. And BLM went along just fine managing the Wild and Scenic River up to that time. Somewhere around either late 1998 or 1999, the BLM state director in Billings notified the field offices where I worked in Lewistown that the Washington office wanted to know if there was any places worthy of some special designation. The Lewis and Clark bicentennial was coming up, and that maybe was in part what was driving it. But at the time, I think Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt wanted to instill more pride within BLM by letting them manage some of these special areas and move beyond the perception that BLM stands for the Bureau of Livestock and Mining. I always thought it stood for the Bureau of Long Meetings. We suggested something involving the Wild Scenic River. The Washington office countered with, why don't you do something involving the breaks? But the true breaks are further downstream, more around the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. So we thought it was better to focus on the Wild and Scenic River and the adjacent tracts of BLM land. We prepared a draft map with a boundary on it, and we tried to exclude as much private land as possible, but because of the intermingled land pattern, it was impossible to exclude everything, or we probably would have excluded most of the BLM land. Early in 1999, we were told we needed to have some public meetings. We scheduled 2 or 3 public meetings around the state, and we also scheduled an open house for the Montana State Legislature, which was in session at that time. And I think we had a difficult time trying to explain to people what we were thinking about because of the vagueness of the proposal. We really caught everybody off guard. They didn't really understand what we were contemplating, and I'm not sure we totally did either. An interesting thing about the briefing we put on for the legislature, very few members came. It was an evening meeting, but the local legislator representing Lewistown came, and he waxed eloquently about how his family loved the river. They'd floated it several times. I thought he might be a supporter. As soon as he found out it was controversial and the ranchers in the area were going to oppose it, he became one of the most strident opponents of any designation. But anyway, the gist of that was, because people didn't understand it, what was really being contemplated, there was either a lack of support or most of the comments were against doing anything special. Well, the secretary, I don't think, wanted to drop it. So in the spring of 1999, Secretary Babbitt and at that time Senator Max Baucus came and jet boated on the river along with Stephen Ambrose, who wrote Undaunted Courage, and a gentleman by the name of Dayton Duncan, who has oftentimes been a collaborator with Ken Burns on some of his PBS specials. And we jet boated down to an area called Monroe Island and put up a small riparian fence. And the idea was to give the whole episode some publicity and try to enlighten people what was maybe going to happen. Then in the summer of 1999, because most of the public meetings we had held were negative to this, in the summer of 1999, instead of letting it drop, the secretary worked with the chairperson of the Bureau of Land Management 15-member citizen advisory council called the Resource Advisory Council, or RAC. And at that time, Hugo Turek, who's a rancher from Coffee Creek, Montana, was the chairperson of the RAC. He asked the RAC if they would consider holding public meetings and making some recommendations on how the area should be managed. And so after deliberating at a meeting here in Lewistown, they decided they would take on the task, and they ultimately held 7 meetings around the state. Just as an aside, I always thought it was really funny. At the very first meeting, I had breakfast with a county commissioner from up on the High Line who happened to be on the RAC. And he was convinced that this possibility was so outrageous that everyone would clearly see it was a bad idea. And he said after the first RAC meeting, he thought this whole thing would go away. Well, the next 2 years of many public meetings and a lot of publicity, that proved to be wrong. By this time, some of the environmental groups like the Montana Wilderness Association, the Wildlife Federation, and the Wilderness Society had finally realized kind of what was at stake, and they started building support, and Dennis can talk more about that. Secretary Babbitt came to Montana on a couple occasions. He held 2 small, by invitation only meetings with stakeholders. The ranchers, especially in the Winifred area, were angry. As I mentioned earlier, they had long memories about some of their relatives being kicked off their land when Fort Peck was put in. Sounds very much, as an aside, again, like the opposition to the American Prairie Reserve proposal right now. It's just any change seems to be met with opposition. Petitions were being circulated against any kind of action. Protests were held. Some people, I think, were ostracized. At one point during this period of time, there was a boat trip, I think it was a jet boat trip, involving a representative from, I guess, the predecessor of the Friends, a BLM employee, and others. They were on the river, and one of the private landowners accused them of trespassing on private land. I know they didn't, because the BLM employee was thoroughly familiar with the river. But anyway, the sheriff issued them a citation. They went to court. Dennis represented them. And I always laugh at Dennis can correct me if I'm wrong, but I always laugh at the judgment of the judge. He said, you're innocent, but don't do it again. So, also, let's see, I'm looking at my notes here. In late 1999, the acting BLM state director called our office in Lewistown to inform us that, lo and behold, there were some pending oil and gas lease applications had been filed, some of which were within the area that was being considered for the monument. I guess I really considered these probably a nuisance type of application, or something to maybe make the designation go away. We in Lewistown emphasized that we should not lease until the secretary makes some sort of decision. However, the acting state director, who in his career had mostly an oil and gas background and had been a champion of oil and gas development, asked us, knowing full well what the answer to this question was, he asked us what the current land use plans say with respect to this area for oil and gas leasing. Well, the plans were like 20 years old. And of course they said oil and gas leasing would be allowed. So against our advice, the leases were issued, and subsequently environmental groups filed a lawsuit, and I'll let Dennis cover that if he wants. At the end of December 1999, the Resource Area Advisory Council had completed their work, their 7 meetings, and they presented their findings to Secretary Babbitt. They couldn't come to any consensus on whether there should be a special designation like a monument or a national conservation area, but they made many recommendations for management, which the Secretary accepted, and those ultimately found their way into the proclamation designating the monument. Sometime about this time too, people would ask us in BLM, why do you need a special designation? And one of our answers was, well, one thing, it kind of boosts the area in terms of appropriation. We might be able to get more funding and manage it at a higher level. So Senator Conrad Burns, who was on the appropriation committee in the Senate, this is the US Senate, appropriated $1 million to kind of demonstrate that a special designation wasn't needed. And I know at the time, I thought this money was going to come to the Wild and Scenic River in that area. But really the money, it was very clear from the get-go that the Montana Stock Growers Association and Montana State University were going to be in charge of these funds. And what they did was at various places around the state, if a private landowner would allow access, and anywhere along the Lewis and Clark Trail, they'd put up some signs and do some things like that. So anyway, BLM saw none of that money, none of it went to the Wild and Scenic River or what would become the monument. In the spring of 2000, Secretary Babbitt came back to Montana and held a very large meeting in Great Falls. My recollection is something like 400 people attended. And then he also took a helicopter tour over the area, and he met a small group of people at the Cable Homestead, which is in a remote area of the Bullwhacker. The significant event about this time was he met with the congressional delegation. This is my understanding. I wasn't there, but it was my understanding was he told them, I'll give you a year to do something legislatively, and if you don't, we'll act. Well, the summer of 2000, BLM had a new state director in Billings, and he visited the area, and he proposed, we spent 2 or 3 days with him, and he proposed some additions to the possible boundary, primarily north of the river and in the northeastern section. And then after that, nothing much happened in terms of public participation and media coverage and everything. And I think this lulled some of the opponents to believe that the issue had gone away. However, later in the year, the Secretary's office had us review some draft language, maybe for a potential proclamation, and also, make some adjustments to a possible map with a boundary on it. And then boom, the last day or so of the Clinton administration, he designated the monument using the 1906 Antiquities Act. Well, the opponents freaked out about the designation. They complained they never had any input on the boundary. A map with a possible boundary was at every meeting that BLM ever had and that the Resource Advisory Council ever had. But the opponents of the monument took the position that we're not going to comment on a boundary because it presupposes there might be a designation. So up to that point, they never commented on a boundary. They also complained that the designation was made at the last minute as the door was hitting the Clinton administration on the butt as they went out the door. So they implied they had no input. And that, of course, that ignored all of the meetings that they attended and provided comments on. Well, the Bush administration came in. He had a new Secretary of the Interior, Gail Norton, and she asked then Governor Judy Martz to provide any recommendations on any needed changes. Governor Martz appointed a committee entirely of opponents of the monument. If you remember the local legislator that I mentioned who thought the river was such a wonderful place and then became a big opponent, he was chairperson of this committee. And the county commissioner who thought this would all go away after one meeting was on the committee, and there were a few others. Anyway, Governor Martz said she would only consider written comments. The committee conducted several meetings, and as it turned out, written comments were overwhelmingly in favor of the monument. So no changes were made by the Secretary of the Interior or proposed. Also about this time, and I'm getting close to the end here, Denny Rehberg was newly elected to Congress. He repeatedly tried to get Secretary Norton and President Bush to undesignate the monument, make it go away. And this was all to no avail. Nothing came of his efforts except one ridiculous decision made at some level in Washington. I have no idea where, but the decision was not to make Rehberg shut up and go away. Don't show the monument's boundary on any BLM maps. It was established by the proclamation. It was there, but BLM couldn't show it on any of their maps. Also about this time, the Montana legislature passed a resolution against the monument. And then about the last thing I'm gonna really cover is immediately BLM started its planning efforts to come up with a land use plan for this new monument. Given the guidance from the proclamation, a planning team was established. It consisted of officially recognized interested parties, the state, counties, tribes were invited. I don't recall that any of them participated. The public could attend but not comment. And these efforts were geared to eventually coming up with alternatives that would eventually make it into a land use plan and an EIS. And I just have one final thought. In all of this, I really believe we might not have a monument were it not for the work and efforts of Hugo Turek. Hugo Turek is a rancher, as I mentioned, in Coffee Creek. Hugo was the chairperson of the Resource Advisory Council. He worked really hand in hand with Secretary Babbitt, trying to resolve issues. He testified after the monument was created when Congress was having hearings. He's been a member of the board of the Friends, I think, from the get-go. And if anybody deserves some sort of recognition, it's Hugo. Dennis, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. And I'm going to probably cover some of the ground you have from a different perspective, but let me introduce myself by saying this. Back in the mid-1970s, I was living in Havre and working there. And on the weekends, I spent my time hiking or skiing in the Bear Paws. And I spent several days climbing Bear Paw Baldy, even in the winter. And that was my first introduction to the breaks. I could look west from Bear Paw Baldy and see the Rocky Mountains. much as Clark thought he could see the Rocky Mountains in 1805 when he climbed a prominence in Cow Creek and thought he was looking at the Rockies. He was probably seeing the Highwood Mountains with snow on them. But from Bear Paw Baldy, you can look to the south, and the rolling shoulders of the Bear Paws sloping down to the rough ground and the rangeland, and then those deep, sinuous coulees with crooked fingers leading to the Missouri River. I thought it was terrific. It's wild land I could see from up there. But it was 25 years before I ever set foot on that land, even though I had canoed the river and walked the banks and kind of scrambled around. It was 25 years before I ever made it there. And then 25 years later, I'm in Great Falls. I was president of the Montana Wilderness Association State Council. And in 1998, 1999, their gaze turned toward central Montana and those BLM lands that Dave was talking about, because word had reached us. Something's happening. Something's going to happen on the BLM lands in central Montana. Now, the Montana Wilderness Association at that time was really, working hard on other things like the roadless rule that the Clinton administration put in. That was our effort. But we switched gears to a major extent. And that's due to a couple of people in our organization. And I'll talk about them later. But we saw an opportunity for permanent designation of wild country. And this is wild country that contained, areas of critical environmental concern, 6 wilderness study areas. It was fantastic to think what could happen here. So in 1999, as Dave explained, Bruce Babbitt comes to Montana. He floats the river. Dayton Duncan is with him, along with Stephen Ambrose. And this created a stir. In the summer of 1999, the Great Falls Tribune had an article, and it was entitled "The Future of the Breaks." And this is where I think some of the stuff really hit the fan, because all of a sudden, people across the state realized that there was something that was going to occur here. And if it was going to be permanent, then a lot of people are going to be involved, and a lot of people are going to feel like their so-called rights or their activities are going to be trampled on. At the same time, and Dave, you sort of mentioned this, and I'd seen this in my notes somewhere, is that Bruce Babbitt asked the BLM for a segregation. And it was my understanding that a segregation of the area was a commitment to keep the status quo. In other words, don't lease any land for mining or oil and gas or anything like that. Well, because the opposition right away in the summer of 1999 was such that the BLM got a lot of backlash, is that they dropped the whole idea of segregation. Well, guess what happens? And also in the summer of 1999, Senator Conrad Burns is down in Billings, and he has a speech in front of the Billings Petroleum Club. And in that speech, he tells the people there, who are basically, oil and gas developers, drillers, that changes are coming to the BLM land in central Montana. Within a month and a half, 100 new leases of oil and gas development occur. 8 of them are in the lands of what are now within the monument, and 3 of those were in the wild bullwhacker area. Well, the MWA, volunteers and our coordinator, Mark Good, many of you know Mark, realized that, hey, wait a minute, things are changing on the ground already with something we thought was going to be permanently protected. And so there were quite a few volunteers of our organization started to take a look, very close look at what the BLM was doing in this land that apparently was, designated for something brand new. Now, in that regard, we began to take a look at what the BLM was doing on the ground. We went out on the ground of the bullwhacker. We were checking out some of these areas where the leases were, found what we thought was an illegal pipeline. we started to take a look at the documents that were the documents which allowed leasing. And that's what you mentioned, Dave, is that they look back at these land management plans from what, 20 years ago or whatever. I can't remember the names of them. But it was determined that there was something amiss. So this is occurring, throughout the remainder of 2000. But what also occurs in 2000 is that, in 1999, as we're doing this, is a lot of people are getting excited, as our volunteers. And I want to mention a lot of these names as we go on here, but really Mark Good, who was the employee of the Montana Wilderness Association, Dirk Van Heining, who was, he grew up in Lewistown, who was living in Great Falls at the time. They worked like Trojans. They were very hard working people. And what happens next, which is in March of 2000, the MWA filed a lawsuit in federal court against the BLM we narrowed it down to 3 leases, the 3 leases in the Bullwhacker. We alleged that the BLM had violated NEPA, had violated FLPMA, and had violated the National Historical Preservation Act. Jumping ahead to 2004, Judge Don Malloy, the federal district court judge, ruled in favor of the MWA and said that, yes, they had violated those rules, but as always happens, you never hear about this. What usually happens in these federal court cases is Judge Malloy told the BLM, go back and do it over again and correct your errors. But we did win that lawsuit. That lawsuit was basically the work of 2 people, Mark Good, Dirk Van Heining, a local lawyer, Kathy Lewis. I also helped out, and I think Tim Faber helped out. There was a lot of people that worked on that. So that happens in March of 2000. What also happens in March of 2000 is something that is very important. The Missouri River Stewards Incorporated. The Missouri River Stewards were the major opponents to the monument. They were the people from Winifred and the ranchers along the river and a lot of other folks that they had drawn into their meetings. Also in the spring of 2000, Babbitt comes to Great Falls. This is the meeting that you went to, Dave, in Great Falls. There were hundreds of people there. It was a packed auditorium. Bruce Babbitt had flown in. He stood on the stage for 2 hours. Didn't sit down, just stood on the stage for 2 hours and answering questions, calling on people and answering questions. A monument opponent, who I read what he wrote about, he complained about a, quote, a swarm of national political professionals, unquote, who were at the meeting. I missed those, Dave. Maybe you saw them. I didn't see them. And he further complained that Gloria Flora, and you may remember that name, complained that Gloria Flora, quote, wore 50 pounds of silver jewelry raked from the earth, unquote. And I don't know why he brought that up. Maybe he just didn't like Gloria Flora. I don't know. Maybe he had something to do about silver. But I think that gives you kind of an idea of where some of these folks were coming from. My recollection from the meeting, the thing that really struck me was that there was an awful lot of complaints about landowners who felt that their land was going to be taken away, that it was a government takeover of private land, and that black helicopters were flying around just checking things out. It was pretty silly at some point. So the remainder of the year 2000 did kind of quiet down a little bit. And then bingo, January 17th, 2001, we have the proclamation and the shit hit the fan. And it wasn't necessarily just here in Montana. Dave was right, is that immediately Congress in March of 2001 starts to examine what the Clinton monuments were all about. And so there was a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. about, the so-called Clinton monuments. What are we going to do about them? Rehberg did in April of that year, 2001. He's trying to get he actually submitted a bill and didn't get anywhere, but he submitted a bill trying to cut or gut the Antiquities Act. And it was a major concern that something had to be done about the new monuments, like the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. And therefore, Martz gets a solicitation from Gail Norton, the new Secretary of the Interior, asking her to do what it was, asking her to determine the impact of the monument on, quote, national interests and local needs and concerns. Well, Martz then, by June of that year, she creates the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument Task Force. And Dave was exactly correct. It was loaded with people, basically politicians who disliked the whole idea of the monument. In June of that year, Rehberg holds this Missouri River Summit in Lewistown. And his initial plan was to have a whole panel of monument opponents on stage, bad-mouthing the whole idea of the monument. Well, we were able to embarrass him enough that he allowed some conservationists, environmentalists on the panel. And so me, Hugo, Glenn Monahan, Dave Barley, and Dave Ditloff got on the panel and basically, and we also had done a little trick on Rehberg, because we had brought the Montana Wilderness Association State Council came to Lewistown for a meeting. And so we packed as many MWA people and monument supporters as we could into the auditorium. So we held the floor pretty good. Well, this whole task force deal was corrupt from the beginning. And it was the volunteers that we put together, and it was just a major effort by a lot of people to push back against the arguments that the monument opponents were bringing up, which they were arguing to the so-called task force in these so-called public meetings that they were having. And just to give you an idea of what these arguments were, is that first of all, it's exactly what Dave said, is that a lot of them argued, wait a minute, we were never told this was going to happen. You didn't ask, you never asked us what we wanted. And so we didn't have really any input. And by the way, this whole monument deal is going to affect our whole lifestyle. The ranchers argued this over and over again, is that they were the true stewards of the land. They're the true stewards. They want to, quote, manage the area like they have for generations, quote, without government oversight, unquote. That's what they wanted. And they argued that the whole idea of a monument that extended beyond the wild and scenic river was wrong. And actually, they wanted a monument. They're going to have a monument. They would accede to the idea that, well, yeah, sure, the White Cliffs and some of the historical areas, that would be okay for a monument. They argued that their private property was going to lose value because it was sure to happen, is that the monument designation would then take away their right to graze cattle. They were also concerned that the government was going to buy up their land and then kick them off the land, and their towns like Winifred or Roy or whatever, they're going to just dry up and become ghost towns. They argued that. They also argued that their private property, rather than losing value, would gain value because of the recreational value would be too much for them to come in and buy land from their neighbors because the land was too expensive. And when the neighbors were going broke for some damn reason, they wouldn't be able to buy them out. I heard one of these guys actually argue that to me. They also were concerned that, oh, gee whiz, there would be too many tourists coming, and it would be a, quote, death wish for the breaks. Finally, and this is the thing but this was a quote that was in the Lewistown paper, quote, "We are not ready to make the Missouri River a gift to the nation," unquote. And that's where these folks were coming from. They were not willing to compromise on anything. They were not willing to actually sit down and make a determination of what would be helpful or good for them or for the state of Montana or anything else. It was pretty frustrating, to tell you the truth. So this is all happening during the so-called task force that Martz had put together. And the task force in and of itself delivers this message back to March that, yes, we think there should be a monument. It ought to be the Wild and Scenic River. That's what they wanted. Well, unfortunately for them is that the number of people who supported the monument and actually made written comments to the task force outnumbered them 2-1. And so even though Marks sends off her recommendation to Gail Norton, we turned around and sent off our own recommendation and tried to explain it this way. After the 3 public meetings, which were held in mid-morning during the week, the task force repeatedly had called for written comments. They met and adopted a recommendation to radically shrink the monument boundary without reading the comments. This was true. They never read the comments. The task force utterly corrupted the public process by reaching their conclusions without bothering to determine what the majority of Montanans had said in their letters. Their failure to account for the overwhelming public support favoring the monument and the values it preserves tainted their further deliberations. In an effort to cover up their contempt for opinions and facts with which they did not agree, the task force made up arbitrary and false statements about the written public response. They erroneously claimed that they were appointed to consider local viewpoints, in spite of the governor's direction that they gather their information from all sides. They piously stated that local letters carried more weight than letters from other Montanans. They falsely claimed that many of the letters in support of the monument were from out of state. They arbitrarily dismissed supporters' letters if they did not have the word boundary in them. I mean, this is how silly it got with these folks who were on the so-called task force. But you know what? We beat them back. Except what happened was 9/11. And the Bush regime had something better on their minds rather than mess around with trying to overturn monuments status. So the remainder of 2000 slides to an end. In 2001, this is 2001. And so at the end of 2001, the Friends opened up our office in Lewistown, and we hired Mary Jones as our coordinator, and we started to really get to work on what we had to do next, which was the getting ready for the resource management plan. But let me tell you a little bit about how we formed the Friends to begin with. In 2001, about a month after the proclamation, a very small group of us got together in the Grand Union Hotel in Fort Benton and talked about what we could do to put together a group, to support the proclamation. And it was then that we formed what we then called the Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument. At that time, we only had a small handful of folks, had no money, but we had a lot of support from environmental groups. And Dave mentioned them: the Montana Wilderness Association, the Montana Wildlife Federation, and also the National Parks and Conservation Association. Those 3 groups came together as a coalition and obtained a grant, a substantial grant of money for a Missouri River Monument campaign. And that's the money, the seed money that helped us get along. Now we're nothing. We're not a 501c3. We're not even incorporated at that time. And so the coalition was basically our helpmate and our so-called fiscal agent, because we couldn't handle our own money. We just couldn't do that. I mean, nobody's going to give a group of 5 or 6 people, tens of thousands of dollars for this campaign. But so we had this coalition of the Montana Wilderness Association, Bob Decker, Mark Good, worked very hard for the Montana Wildlife Federation, Craig Sharp, Larry Copenhaver, National Parks and Conservation Association, Tony Jewett, and Patty Borneman. And we also had substantial help from the Wilderness Society, and that was Betsy Buffington. Michaela, if you got those pictures, let's show the pictures I have. I only have a few pictures, but I think it's really important that these people be recognized. And so we should put up a few pictures here, I think. This is a picture out in the breaks from left to right. That's, of course, that's Mary Jones, Dirk Van Heining, Mark Good with his dog Zippy, and Tim Faber. I'm sorry you don't recognize the guy who's sitting down. Maybe somebody else does. I don't recognize him. Go ahead to the next. It's Betsy Buffington with Hugo Turek. Hugo Turek, Mary Jones, Bruce Babbitt, myself and Dave at a meeting that we had in Tucson. It's Mark Gooden out in the breaks. Glenn Braun from Big Sandy, great supporter. Arlo Scari, working on a day for the National Public Lands Day. Dirk Van Heining. Dirk, you can hardly understand how much work Dirk put into this whole effort. It was amazing. Tim Faber, Mary Fries, both worked very hard. This is in the office in Lewistown when we had the office there. Both worked very hard. Tim brought so many people out into the breaks on wild walks. Just practically every summer he did that. Is that the end? Yeah, and there were so many other people involved in this. I'm just going to read you some names because a lot of these folks wound up being on an informal board of directors because they were people that were interested in the monument and helped support us. When he was still around, is Stephen Ambrose, Dave Barley, Jim and Cheryl Gagnon, John Gibson of Billings, Rick and Susie Gratz helped a lot. Jerry Jennings, Randy Gray, who was a mayor of Great Falls at the time, John Lepley out of Fort Benton, Mary Mendel, Glenn Monahan for a while. I don't know if he still does, but he had an outfitting canoe outfitting group on the Missouri. Ron Moody, Mike Penfold, Arlo Scari, of course. Arlo was on the board for a while. Wendy Whitehorn worked for us. We had a lot of folks up there in Havre, including Jim Brenna and Ed Spindler, and my mother-in-law, Arlie Lane, Tony Hagner, the others, Pam Hillary, Clint Lomas, and Mary Fries, of course. People who worked very hard on especially in the next part of our effort to have the proclamation mean something, and that is the work up to the draft resource management plan and the management plan itself. And so that's a lot of the work that we did early on in the 2001, 2002 is we did a lot of work at identifying the issues that we wanted to focus on, recreational airstrips in the monument, motors in the river, the ghost roads, road density, gas leases in the monument, access to the monument, monitoring and enforcement by the BLM, cottonwood restoration. All these topics not only were topics we thought about, but they were topics that a lot of our volunteers and the organizations, especially the Wilderness Society, put together fact sheets we put together fact sheets that tried to explain all these issues from our point of view to the public at large, and to also to try to push back a lot of the false information that the monument opponents were putting out. We, as Dave explained, Denny Reber twice proposed legislation to remove, so-called remove private land from the monument. And Hugo Turk went back and lobbied twice. He spoke to the committee hearings on both occasions. We, members of the Friends, participated in all the BLM open houses, made comments on all those. We hired John Todd to go around the state to editorial boards to talk about the monument, talk about the Antiquities Act. We lobbied in Washington, D.C. And Dave and I both went back to Washington, D.C. On a lobbying mission. Had a lot of help from the Wilderness Society. We published information about the monument with brochures and fact sheets. We discussed how the monument was created. We discussed its special features. We had information published in numerous newspapers, including the Washington Post and the LA Times. We created our own map. We wanted a monument map that had a boundary. We created a website, even though, and we actually had to go out and hire somebody to do it because we did such a poor job with the first one. We sponsored hikes and outings. We did a considerable amount of investigation and research through our volunteers, people that were actually on the ground trying to document any changes that they saw. For example, we're able to see an illegal road being cut. So my recollection, it was down in the old Peon Ranch area down in there. We found out that some of the Pilots Association had been clearing brush off of one of the airstrips, things like that. And we brought all these things to the attention of the BLM, but we saw something that we thought needed to be expressed to them. We put together slideshows, PowerPoints, presentations to civic groups. We created something that was kind of unique, and that was a storyteller's rendezvous. We did 2 of them. A lot of work went into these, and it was supposed to highlight people's personal attachment with the monument and the lands around them. And I thought that they were very well attended. I don't know if we got a lot of support from them, but I think that the people who did attend had a pretty good time. We co-sponsored Dayton Duncan to come out to Great Falls. He gave a very emotional talk because he talked about his time with Stephen Ambrose on the river and the numerous times that he had been on the river floating it, both with his own family and when he and Ken Burns worked on the Corps of Discovery PBS specials that they did. We made numerous educational presentations to the public regarding issues on the monument and about all the issues that were part of our desire to promote the protection of the area as designated in the proclamation, all leading up to the draft resource management plan, finally the resource management plan, record of decision in December 2008. After that, I think the advocacy of the Friends ended with the lawsuits that we filed over the RMP once those were resolved. And now you have a different organization now. Now it's an organization that is more collaborative and probably friendlier, I suppose. They weren't too friendly in the old days. But it's important to remember something about the tenor of what we did as a young organization, essentially working to protect what was already there against what appeared to be a lot of opposition. And the reason I bring that up now is 2 people, Trump and Sinke. When there was no good reason for the Trump administration to attack the monuments, especially the older monuments, the Clinton monuments. And yet they did. And Zinke, you think about him the way you want to, but he essentially did his job as Secretary of the Interior for the short time he was there, with respect to his taking a look at the monument designations, kind of the same way that the Marx administration did. In other words, asking for a lot of public comment and then ignoring it. They did what they wanted to do by talking to, or Zinke did, by talking to the politicians who did not like the monuments within their states. The Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument ducked the the slicing and dicing that occurred to Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase, but not for lack of trying. A lot of the same issues that we dealt with in 2001 by the monument opponents here in Montana were raised once again by the people who still didn't like the monument with Zinke. As a matter of fact, some of the quotes that I gave you earlier with respect to people who were arguing about the monument brought up those same things. And with Zinke, when they try to again undo the Missouri Breaks Monument, it didn't happen, but they gave it a shot. Well, finally, I'd like to say a couple things about Bruce Babbitt, and that is that and Dave mentioned that Bruce Babbitt wanted the BLM to manage the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. He wanted the BLM to manage the landscape monuments because he wanted to change the culture of the BLM. He said that he wanted to change the culture of the BLM away from the Bureau of Lands or mining and logging or whatever. So I think that was very important. And he also said with response to what the Trump administration and Secretary Zinke were doing, he said this. In response to the new attacks on the monuments, he said that the use of the Antiquities Act designating treasured landscapes, even in the midst of intense controversy, was validated by history and the generations of Americans who have this passion for Western landscapes. And that's why I got involved. You have to have a passion for these things. And I'm so glad that there's a lot of you people that are still involved. So that's what I got, Michaela. I'm done.
Guys, so much. Wow, that was a lot of really awesome information. As we're getting a little past 7 o'clock, if you do need to jump off, please feel free. Thank you again to Dennis and Dave, but we do have a couple questions in the chat box for you guys if you're willing to stick around. Will asked, have any of the farmers ranchers' fears been realized since the creation of the monument? Have properties values been impacted significantly, or have grazing / other rights historically enjoyed by locals been impacted by the creation of the monument?
I don't know. Dave, do you have any idea?
Well, I would say no. I mean, I don't have any hard data, but I don't think their fears were realized. BLM has not condemned 1 acre of land in the entire area. I can't think of anything that would substantiate some of those concerns, but it was commonly heard. I remember meeting a couple of women here in Lewistown that we're friends with, and they confronted me with how terrible it was that BLM was condemning all this private land. And I asked them, name one person. And they said, well, that's what we've heard. And, I said that about 3 times, and finally they had to stay quiet because they could not substantiate those kind of comments. I think from my standpoint is I still am a loyal BLM person. the American Prairie Reserve has taken a lot of the heat off of the monument because it's a controversial issue right now. So everything is nice and quiet.
Thanks. There's another question for Dennis. 20 years later, how much and how fervent is the anti-brake sentiment that you encountered in 1999 through 2000?
Well, it was more personal in 1999 or 2000, and now basically the only thing I've seen now is that some of the comments, but basically the same people, again, raising the same very tired arguments against designation of the monument, because it arose again when Donald Trump and Secretary Zinke thought that they needed to review these old monuments. But I only had probably only one run-in with opponents who were angry with me personally. That was years ago.
Yeah, I might add, I think when all was said and done, after BLM's land use plan for the monument was finalized, the local folks and county commissioners had a lot of input on it. And so I think they were relatively satisfied with how that came out. I can't necessarily say the same thing for the Friends or some of the environmental groups. There were still some objectionable things in there. Dennis mentioned some of them, the motors on the river and airstrips, things like that. But
another question for Dennis. Any thoughts or hopes with the appointment of Deb Holland as Director of the Interior?
Well, I don't know. All I've read about Deb Holland is from what I saw in the newspaper, and I'm very hopeful. And one of the reasons I would say I'm hopeful is, and maybe Dave remembers this, when we were down in Tucson years ago, one of the speakers was Representative Grijalva out of Arizona, and he was a very good proponent of protection of public lands. And so Holland has to be, I think, basically from that same cut. So I'm hopeful that first of all, I think she's going to put a lot of effort into undoing what the Trump administration tried to do, especially with oil and gas leasing and the threats to upland birds like the sage grouse.
Thanks for that. There are a couple other questions, but for the sake of time, we're going to start wrapping things up. If your questions didn't get answered and you'd like to ask them, please feel free to email. I'm happy to pass along questions to Dave or Dennis or answer them myself. Once again, I just want to thank our speakers, Dennis and Dave. It's so awesome to hear from two people who are actually there during all of these events. You can read as much as you want in paperwork, and you're never going to get the full story until you talk to somebody who's actually there. So especially as our 20th anniversary comes up on Sunday, hearing about all of this tremendous work that went into designating the monument, creating the Friends, all the various groups that took part in it and are still strong supporters of our organization, MWA, MWF, National Park Service. We're working with all of them still to this day. And although we have changed quite a bit, like Dennis mentioned, we're an ever-evolving organization that just responds to what's happening in the climate at the time. I think that same sentiment is still there, that we're people who are passionate about this wilderness and about this landscape. So once again, thank you guys for joining us. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. We still have one more Tune In Tuesday in 3 weeks, so that'll be visiting the topic of recreation on the monument, so getting ready to play outside. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And if you aren't already a member or signed up for our email list, please do that at MissouriBreaks.org. And we'll see you next time. Have a good night, everybody.